powerful earthquake has struck northeastern Japan.
That destroyed communities in seconds. As many as 1,000 homes burned.
Everywhere we look, things appear to be coming apart at the seams. Political tensions, civil upheaval, natural disasters, concern over governmental powers restricting personal freedoms. Every human effort that has ever been attempted at making a utopian society has ultimately failed, and now it appears as though we are on the verge of repeating that same course again. Is all of this pointing to something bigger? If so, then what? In a time of uncertainty, we can look to the Bible for answers. Join us now, as in the Scriptures, in association with the ministry It Is Written, as we bring you the series Revelation Today, The Great Reset, coming to you from Murphy, North Carolina. In Canada, they have a constitution there, and there's a portion of it that reads such: whereas the provinces of Canada, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick have expressed their desire to be federally united into one dominion under the crown of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, with a constitution similar in principle to that of the United Kingdom. And whereas such a union would conduce to the welfare of the provinces and promote the interests of the British Empire. Now that was something that was put together in 1867. And it's funny how it is that we use these constitutions. That was the preamble to their constitution. And of course, in Canada's constitution is the supreme law of the country. In many ways that we also have these kinds of supreme laws. We looked at an earlier evening of how it is that we have this system of courts. We have, local courts and state courts, and we have the Supreme Court. And then there's even the International Court of Law, which is based over in the European nations. But they have all of these systems of law and courts and constitutions that govern how things are done. But interestingly, here we have Canada that's putting forth a constitution, but Britain, oddly enough, doesn't really have their own constitution. They have something that's called more of a uncodified constitution. So it's interesting how you have a nation that puts together a constitution to be under the rule of a nation that doesn't have a constitution. But we, of course, do have a constitution. We have something that has been penned and has created the freedoms that you and I are able to enjoy. In fact, the opening lines, "We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America." That's the first sentence of our national Constitution. And it's actually considered to be one of the oldest codified written national constitutions that there is in the world. And it has these several functions, one of which is to establish the governing bodies. Who can remember what, back from grade school government class, what were some of the governing bodies that we have? We have the executive branch, we have the legislative branch, and we have what? The judicial, yes, thank you. And what else does this do? It provides for a separation of powers between the federal and the state. Interestingly enough, when our forefathers were putting together how the nation would be run, they did not intend for the national government to do everything. They actually wanted the national government to be rather small and to handle things that are much more difficult for the states themselves to handle, such as having a national defense system, an army, if you will. Because it's much harder to have if you have somebody who's going to attack the nation, and then you have to coordinate all of these different states and their own separate militias to be able to defend the nation. But they were really wanting more of the governing power to be left in the states. Okay. Now today we see this movement that is really trying to flip that over on its side, so that more power is in the hands of the federal government, so that there's more centralized control of things. But there's a reason why it is that our forefathers, our national forefathers, didn't want that to be the case. Do you know why? Because the majority of them had come from places where the national government, what they said, that was it. Kings who decreed. That's why they never had a king in the United States, because they didn't want to have this all-powerful government that could dictate every little area of your life. They wanted people to have freedom to move about and to choose the directions of life that they would take. Now, there were some amendments that were made to the Constitution, and here is one of them. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free expression thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Now, why do you suppose an amendment like that would have been made? Could it be perhaps because there were moments where the government would act and the people had no voice in what it is that had happened? They just had to go along with whatever it was their governmental powers had said. Whatever the king decreed, the people had no choice, unless you get into armed conflict with the ruling power, in which case you, in most cases, came out on the losing end. Because they were the ones that had the weapons. They were the ones that had the power and the pull to do the things that they wanted to enforce. Most of the people were more peasants. They had to fight with pitchforks. And yes, some of them had firearms. But for the most part, the condition was such that in the forming of this nation, they didn't want what was happening in other countries to be what was forming here in this country. And so they had these amendments that would put in. But when these amendments are made, there's a process that's involved. And it's a rather lengthy process. It's not just some simple little thing. It could take quite some time for amendments to be made. And there have been many amendments that have been made over the years. This process of amendments was put there in place for the purpose of unforeseen issues that could arise. There's something that could be said about a governing body that takes into account things can change over time. We are not going to foresee every issue that can arise. And so they create a process in which amendments can be made to the Constitution so that as these issues arise, they can be addressed in a legitimate way that actually doesn't try to suppress the people, which ends up being the case sometimes, but actually further defines what our freedoms are supposed to be. This process of laws is put there very deliberately. Now, of course, there are some who are really trying to bring that whole process into question. Most of us have been hearing things about the movement to try to abolish the filibuster. Which you turn the clock back just a very short period of time, and the people who have the loudest voices right now of getting rid of the filibuster also had the loudest voices not so long ago of saying we can't get rid of the filibuster until it fits our agenda. Then we will get rid of it, and then we'll complain about the other people who try to abuse the lack of the filibuster later on when we have lost power. Because that's what government does. Make sure you blame the other guy for what you're doing. That's usually how it works. But we have this whole system here in our country of how we can have these amendments, how we can adjust our laws accordingly in a way that is supposed to, in a perfect world, supposed to benefit the people. Okay? So let me ask you this. How does a system like this work in a heavenly government? I've posed this question in the past. When God makes something, and I'm not talking about the process of how he makes it. You know, we look at the creation story and we see him speak things into existence. He formed man out of the dust of the ground. But there's a very specific term that's used in that creation story. When he looks at everything, he pronounces it what? Very good, right? When God is finished making something, what can we call that finished product? Perfect, right. What do you do when you alter perfection? What do you now have? What is altered perfection is imperfection, all right? And so one of the illustrations I use is we're sitting on these pews with this beautifully constructed wood and this carpet that's here. It's made all nice and soft. We have this piano, this beautiful piano that produces wonderful sound for us. But really, if you think about it, what have we done in order to make all of these things for our use? We've taken the trees and the various forms of materials that are used to construct these things, and we have altered them from their original state, from the way God had intended them for to be. So what have we then made? We've made something rather imperfect. Now, of course, we're really good at patting ourselves on the back for doing this, And by no means, this does not mean that we should never cut down a tree and try to use the materials that God has provided for us to construct the things that we have for ourselves to use. But what it does mean is that when we're doing these kinds of things, we need to be doing the utmost of our craftsmanship to do so that we have these nice finished products at the end of the process. But let's take that a step further. When God proclaims what his governmental system looks like, what is it? It's a perfect system of law. So when we take and alter what God has already deemed to be perfect, what have we made? We've made an imperfect situation. So how is it then that we have so many passages in the Bible that really do talk about this issue of a change to God's law? Why would those kinds of changes occur? What would those changes be, and how do they pertain to us? Well, let's take a look at one of those verses right now. This comes from Colossians chapter 2. Blotting out the handwriting of ordinances that was against us, which was contrary to us, and took it out of the way, nailing it to the cross. Now, does this mean that the system of law that this is referring to was somehow a bad system? And that's why God said, nope, it's too bad. It was my mistake. I shouldn't have done that. So now I'm going to move it out of the way. I'm going to remove it from the people because it's just too hard. I messed up. Does that sound like the kind of rationale that God would use? I made a mistake. I should not have put this out there because now I have done what Lucifer's accusations say, that I am overbearing and arbitrary and a tyrannical ruler. Well, no, there's actually a reason to this. It's because the ordinances that are referred to here had a specific purpose. And when that purpose was completed, there's no more need for them. We talked about this just a bit last night, but we had that whole sacrificial system of feast days and of sacrifices that were accompanied with them. And when Jesus came, he met the fulfillment. This is where we talk about type and anti-type meet, okay? And for example, the Passover had been pointing to all along had now come, and he was that sacrifice that takes sin out of our lives, and that is what leads us to freedom from the bondage to sin, just like the initial Passover back in Egypt was that thing that freed the people of Israel from the bondage of slavery to Egypt, okay? I actually remember somebody telling me that, I was never in Egypt, and so there's portions of the Ten Commandments that don't apply to me because I was never in Egypt. Because, when you read the Ten Commandments in Exodus chapter 20, you can also read a second copy of them in Deuteronomy chapter 5. And actually the Sabbath commandment, as it's recorded there in Deuteronomy 5, mentions, for you were slaves in Egypt. And they use this rationale to say, well, I was never a slave in Egypt, so that doesn't apply to me. So then, using that exact same logic, let's ask ourselves a question. Is it okay for us to worship idols? I don't see anybody saying yes. Now, why do I ask that question? Because in Exodus, how is it that the Ten Commandments start? I am the Lord your God who has done what? Brought you out of the house of bondage, out of Egypt. Okay, and then what does he say after that? You shall have no other gods before me. Okay? So if we use a very consistent logic, if we're going to say because you and I were never in Egypt, therefore the Sabbath commandment doesn't apply to us, then that means also it's okay for us to worship idols. But where, anywhere in the Bible, do we ever find anything that says idol worship is okay? Ever. We never find it. Because all of us were in Egypt, and when we were in bondage to sin. Every single one of us have been there. Egypt is a symbol of the bondage to the slavery of sin. And so when this whole system that God had established, the sacrificial system, it was pointing to what God was going to do through Christ for humanity, through the death of Christ on the cross, through the ability for sin to be removed from our lives, hence the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and the resurrection of Christ from the dead, the Feast of First Fruits, and so on. And Paul is very clear here that he has taken the handwriting of ordinances that was against us, which was contrary to us, and took it out of the way. So now, here's the question I have for you. If we just read a text a few moments ago before I got started here about how it is that God doesn't change, then why do we see God changing? Didn't he establish this law? If he did, was it perfect to begin with? Well, the answer to all those questions is yes, but it's also had a perfect purpose to be fulfilled, and it was met in the person and the death and the resurrection of Christ. Once that has been accomplished, now this system is no longer necessary. He actually replaced it with something else. We call it the communion service. We talked about that last night as well, where he even said, as often as you do this, this eating of the unleavened bread, the drinking of the grape juice, as often as you do this, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. So he took all these different things, remove them, and exchange them for something else that has a very specific purpose. Now, of course, he never told us of a specific time of when to do this. We can kind of imagine, around about when the Passover would be, because that's around about when Jesus himself was doing it. But there is no do this often. There are some churches that do it every week. There are some that do it once a year. There are some that do it 4 times a year. I know a guy who says he does it every single day. And that's fine. There really is no prescribed time of how often this needs to be done. But what we have to keep in mind is that we aren't doing it just to kind of earn points. What are we doing? We're doing it to proclaim the Lord's death till he comes. So now what happened when this whole system, how do we see the biblical evidences of this system being brought to an end, being moved out of the way? Well, when Christ was there on the cross and he breathes his last, there are several events that happened around that same time. Here in Mark 15 it reads, the veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. Now, why was that veil there to begin with? What was the purpose of that veil? Where was the veil located? We mentioned earlier about how we had the sanctuary and the tabernacle in the Old Testament, and the temple that was eventually built by Solomon and so forth. And it had these 2 compartments, the holy place and the most holy place. And there was this thick, heavy veil that was meant to hang between those 2 compartments to keep separation. And only the high priest was enabled to go into the most holy place, and it was only at a specific time of the year that he could do it. So with the significance of this tearing of the veil tells us several things. One of those things that it tells us is that this whole temple service is now irrelevant. This is no longer what is needed, because now we don't have to come to an earthly temple in order to have access to God. We can go straight to heaven itself in our prayers and have direct access to God. Hence Paul saying that we can come boldly before the throne of grace. So let's just take a moment real quick and have a minute of review of what it was that was contained in God's 10 Commandment law, which was not abolished. We have here first, thou shalt have no other gods before me. Secondly, we have, thou shalt not make unto thee any graven images. Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, nor serve them. Continuing on in verse 7, thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. God, we talked about this last night, God has set aside time that he blessed, that he made holy for us to enter into relationship with him. Very deliberate relationship. I remember listening to somebody who said, the Bible doesn't say anywhere that you're supposed to go to church on Sabbath. And to which I said, the Bible does say that the Sabbath is a time of a holy convocation. It says it several times at the time of holy convocation. A time of gathering together. That's what a holy convocation is coming together for corporate worship. That's what holy convocation means. Honor thy father and thy mother. And incidentally, this commandment goes on to say that the reason you do this is so that your days may be long upon the earth. You want to know what the heart of this commandment really is? Is the whole idea of when you are older and your parents can't really take care of themselves anymore, you take care of them. Okay, that is what this is really talking about. You honor your father and your mother to the best of your abilities as far as you can. Thou shalt not kill. Better understood as thou shalt not murder. Verse 14, thou shalt not commit adultery. Again, I don't think there really needs to be a whole lot of explanation here. Thou shalt not steal. If it doesn't belong to you, leave it alone. Thou shalt not bear false witness. And lastly, what do we have? Thou shalt not covet. And if you think about it, This might not necessarily be the first recorded sin in the Bible, but it is actually the first sin in the Bible, is covetousness. Because it happened before the earth was even created in Lucifer coveting the throne of God. And it's what led to the entire mess that we are in today, is covetousness. And how many times does the issue of covetousness take form? In how many different ways does it take form for us today? Oh, look at those boots. Look at whatever that other person has. I wish I had that. Look at their home. Look at their car. Look at whatever. And then you desiring that same thing for yourself. Covetousness. As we look at this, there are principles into every single one of these commandments, underlying principles. Let's just imagine if we lived in a world where everybody obeyed thou shalt not steal. Imagine just how much more simple your life would have been. Your life would be now if everybody just obeyed that one commandment. Okay? How many of you could leave your doors unlocked? How many of you could leave your doors wide open? You know, when it's hot in the summer, let a little bit of cool breeze through. We're just going to leave the doors open, right? And you wouldn't have to worry about anybody coming in taking your stuff. Okay? Just how much more simple would life be if everybody obeyed just even that one commandment? But the Bible also talks about a time when somebody would come along that is called the man of sin, or it's even called the man of lawlessness. Let's take a look at a text here. Let no one deceive you by any means. For that day will not come. What is the day that's being referred here? The second coming, okay? The end of all things that we can think of. For that day will not come unless the falling away comes first, and the man of sin is revealed, the son of perdition, who opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God or that is worshipped, so that he sits as God in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. Now really, if you think about it, this is very significant. And given that in the book of Revelation, we see that there's this move away from faithfulness to God, ultimately when it is that Christ shows up, there's only two groups. The Bible refers to them as the sheep and the goats. Those would be on the right hand of God, and those would be on the left hand of God. We look at how it is that they are both addressed. Those ones on the right hand of God, they're said, enter into my kingdom, you who have been faithful. And to those on the left hand, there is a whole smattering of people who say, didn't we do all these things in your name? We preached, we prophesied, we did all these wonderful things, and we used your name in doing it. But what is it that God says to them? Depart from me. I didn't know you. I never knew you, he actually says. So that is actually very significant. So let's take a look at one more thing here. This is something that's kind of really in the heart of the law of God, the commandments of God. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall do no work, you, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your cattle, nor your stranger who is within your gates. And now it gives the reason. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Or he hallowed it. That's what hallowed means, is to make something holy. So that's the fourth commandment. That's right there. It's right in the heart of God's 10 commandments. It's the longest of all of God's 10 commandments. And it's the only one that points out who he is, the sovereign creator of all things. Okay? Would it make sense then that the one commandment that's at the heart of the 10 commandments that he wrote that identifies who he is as the creator, he would then say is now irrelevant? And it has no bearing on your life anymore. This was a gift that God had given to the human family. What is it that the Sabbath was for? Well, we've read it in the commandment. One of the things that it's for is rest, right? God kind of knew that in the busyness of life, we would need opportunity for rest, didn't he? And he's not talking about just taking a nap during the day or even sleeping overnight or whatever the case may be, but to actually break away from all those things that are invading your mind and resting from them all. There's another thing that it provides for, and that is time to connect with each other. There's something to be said about being able to connect with your friends and with your family and being able to strengthen those bonds and those ties of relationship. It also provides time for us to connect with God. And aside from that, it's also a memorial. Remember how it is. What did that Sabbath commandment do? It identified who God is, and how did it do that? What did this commandment point to identify God as the sovereign of all things? But he is the creator. the one who made heaven and earth, the sea, and all these different things. And it's very interesting how it is that this very same language is used again, and I'll come back to that. Not only is God our creator, but he's also what? Our recreator. The one who spoke all things into existence is also the one who donned humanity and who hung on the cross to pay for our sins. So the one who gave us life and breath is also the one who gives us a chance at salvation. Yet there are many who like to look at different texts and say, that one just doesn't matter anymore. Yes, it's good not to kill. Yes, it's good not to steal. Yes, it's good not to lie. And yes, it's good to honor your parents, but Sabbath really doesn't matter anymore. I mean, it's just a day, isn't it? Did God really make such a big deal about a day after all? Well, did he? It seemed to make a big enough deal to etch it in stone. Okay? So that tells us really one big thing. It matters to God. And what matters to God should matter to us. When we look at this vast universe, we can barely even comprehend it. And of course, I'm sure most of you have all heard the news about this brand new satellite that's been launched. And right now it's in this process of opening up. And it's supposed to be so many more times more powerful than the Hubble telescope. And it's supposed to see way off into these vast distances that Hubble was never even able to reach. It's got a much bigger mirror in it and so on, a much bigger lens. And it's supposed to be so many more times powerful. And they're thinking now we're going to be able to see the edge of the universe. And I just think they're going to see the edge of disappointment, personally, because the further they look, the more they're going to say, wow, this is bigger than we thought. Because that's what has happened over and over and over again. How many of you have ever seen the picture of what's called the Hubble deep field shot, where they trained the Hubble on this one spot and they left the exposure open for a long time so that it could take in all the light possible to look at what's in this huge void right there. And then they got it and they blew it up and they found out that void wasn't so empty after all. There were hundreds of thousands of stars and galaxies in that void. Things were much further away than they had ever thought. Guess what? They're going to do that very same thing again. They're going to take this brand new powerful telescope, they're going to train it in some other spot, they're going to do the exact same thing and say, wow, there's more out there than we thought. What do you know? Now the science books are going to have to go from 14.6 or 14.8 billion years old to whatever the year is they use now. Now it's going to have to be, well, maybe it was 20 million years, or billion years, I'm sorry. Or maybe they're going to even go beyond that. Because God has always been around, and he is a God who creates. He is a God who loves life. And the universe is far older than we give God credit for. But as we look at all of this vastness that is the universe, we have this fantastic concept that regardless of how vast God and his creation is, he provided time for you and him to connect. Very deliberate time. In the midst of all of this vastness, he was thinking of you as an individual. Now, what does that do for your concept of who God is and how we should relate to him? If he has all of this at his disposal, that he is still concerned for you as an individual. How many times do we think it's significant when some important leader of a nation, the president of the United States, and you can fill in the blank for whichever president you want it to be, okay? If you don't like the current one, imagine somebody else. Think of your favorite president. Some tragedy has struck your home, and that president calls you up to express their concern. Maybe they even stop by and sit with you at your kitchen table and just talk about this loss that you've experienced, and they express their bereavement over the fact that you have had this terrible tragedy take place. How significant would that be? This person who has the entire country to run, but yet they took the time to sit with you at your kitchen table and to tell you how sorry they are for your bereavement. There was a time when presidents actually did something like that. And not just for political points, but because they were truly, genuinely concerned about the people that they ruled over. Today, they're genuinely concerned about your vote, getting in power and staying in power. To them, you're nothing but a stepping stone. And unfortunately, that's true for far too many people. But for God, it is not. And he demonstrates that fact by providing us with this whole issue of the Sabbath. Now, consider something, if you will. How is it, if this whole issue of the Sabbath is so important, did we come to a point where it has become so irrelevant to so many people? Because that's really the question. Most everybody recognizes that the Sabbath is on the seventh day of the week. Most everybody does. The question becomes, is it relevant? Does it still apply? Okay, we can all see that Jews around the world continue keeping the Sabbath on the seventh day of the week. Okay? We can all see these systems of times and seasons that God has created for us. The sun, the moon, all these things that can govern how the length of a year, the length of a month, the length of a week. Every single one of these work independent of each other. They do not govern one another. They are independent of each other. And so why is it that something like the Sabbath that God established very clearly, very plainly, that obviously matters to him, doesn't matter to us very much? How is it that we can take the law of God and be so flippant with it to say that it really doesn't matter? God changed all of that stuff. Well, what does the Bible tell us about some of this? Remember, the Bible says, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. So what do we then end up saying about that? In the New Testament, there are quite a few mentions of the Sabbath. There's also a few mentions of the first day of the week. Of course, it doesn't mention Saturday or Sunday because those words weren't used in the time. They used other words, other ways of referring to the days, but Sabbath was always referred to as Sabbath. It was always the seventh day of the week, and it was always this cycle. But there are times when what we refer to as Sunday are mentioned. Let's take a look at some of those. So when it was evening on that day, the first day of the week, and when the doors were shut where the disciples were, for fear of the Jews, Jesus came and stood in their midst and said to them, peace be to you. So let me ask you this. Is this a worship service? Now, keep this in mind. The crucifixion had happened. Okay? Christ was laid in the tomb. There had already been a proclamation from somebody else at this point that he had been risen. But most of them didn't believe it yet, did they? So is this the first worship service on the first day of the week? I mean, what's the logic? The logic is that we go to church, well, one of the logics, I should say, is that we go to church on Sunday in honor of the resurrection. Okay? So were they gathered together on the first day of the week? On this text, yes. Were they in worship? Why were they gathered together? For fear of the Jews. And incidentally, as I said before, most of them didn't even believe the resurrection had taken place. So how can they be gathering together to honor something that they didn't even believe in? Okay? Obviously, they were not gathered together for a worship service. They were gathered for fear of the Jews. They were gathered together for protection, if you will, to kind of keep themselves from harm's way. There's another text in 1 Corinthians that's sometimes used about this whole issue of the first day of the week. Now, concerning the collection for the saints, as I have given orders to the churches in Galatia, so must you do also. On the first day of the week, let each one of you lay something aside, storing up as he may prosper, that there be no collections when I come. So what is he instructing? This is one of those texts that say, see, first day of the week, lay it by your side. So obviously he's talking about a worship service. No, that's not what he's talking about at all. What he is driving at is that when the new week begins, consider what it is that you can contribute for this relief effort that we're taking funds back to Jerusalem to help the people who are being oppressed there. Consider what it is that you can contribute and lay it by your side. What does that mean, lay it by your side? It means at home. Okay? It doesn't mean take it to the church. Why is he saying that there be no collections when I come? What would happen? Paul's trying to get through, he's trying to get down to Jerusalem, he's trying to get through town quickly, and everybody has gathered together in one place to bring their financial contribution to this trip, and they all meet Paul, and this is where he gathers all this stuff together. What do you suppose would have happened? I don't really think they would have robbed him, but I kind of think there would have been a long, drawn-out fellowship dinner. Okay? Everybody would have wanted to talk with Paul. Everybody would have wanted to spend time with this apostle, and it would have delayed him. Rather, he can kind of get through town, going from house to house, collecting these things, shake hands, thank them, discuss things for a moment, and be on his way. Okay? So there's a very specific reason why Paul is instructing for all of this to happen the way that it is happening. He's looking for the expediency of getting through. And incidentally, he doesn't say he's coming on the first day of the week. He just says that when I come, whenever it is that's going to be. But he is saying that after Sabbath is over, take some time on the first day of the week, consider what you can contribute, and lay that by your side at home so that it can be collected quickly when we come through town. This is all that's talking about. Now let's take a look here in Acts chapter 18. After these things, Paul departed from Athens to Corinth, and he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and persuaded both Jews and Greeks. So while he was in Corinth, Paul kept the Sabbath. And who was it that he was just writing that message to about collections for the saints? That was, where was that passage found? It was in Corinthians, right? So the people that he had spent time there, that his own actions demonstrated a keeping of the Sabbath, would he then contradict that by saying, it just doesn't matter anymore? We've already looked at how it is in our previous time together that when it comes to the whole message of a change of the Sabbath, that there were very clear opportunities where this could have been made, but it's silent. There's nothing there. When Paul is there and he's making a proclamation and the Jews don't want to hear it, so they leave, but there's Greeks who say, we want to hear these same words preached to us. And Paul says, well, let's get together tomorrow. What does he do? It tells us clearly that the next Sabbath, almost the entire city showed up. Okay? If there was ever an opportunity to say that the Sabbath does not apply to non-Jewish people, that would have been it. If there was ever one, that would have been it. But it's silent on this issue. And believe me, I'm not going to get into all of this, but there is so much more to this topic that we're going to get into through the rest of this series. But we continue in the book of Acts. This is chapter 20. Now, on the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to break bread, Paul, ready to depart the next day, spoke to them and continued his message until midnight. There were many lamps in the upper room where they were gathered together, and in a window sat a certain young man named Eutychus, who was sinking into a deep sleep. He was overcome by sleep, and as Paul continued speaking, he fell down from the third-story window and taken up dead. Now, what's the big point that we can take from this passage? Don't fall asleep on your preacher. But what is it that's happening here? They're coming together. Why do we have to have this description of many lamps in the room? Remember how we have already looked at when in understanding how biblical chronology takes place. When the sun sets, the next day is beginning. Okay? It's not this midnight, noon, anything like that. It's when the sun is setting, the next day is beginning. So today, when the sun sets, if we were thinking in biblical terms, we would think that this is the eve of Sunday, the eve of the first day of the week. And then when the sun sets on Sunday, we'd be thinking it's the eve of Monday, and so on and so forth. But we don't think that way because we've been trained midnight and noon and all that kind of stuff. But the people in biblical times, specifically the Jewish people, didn't think that way. And they weren't the only ones, but most people actually considered that when the sun was setting, the next day was beginning. Okay? So then why is it that there are many lamps in the room? With that kind of logic in mind, if they're gathering on the first day of the week and there are lamps in the room, why do you have lamps? Because it's dark, right? So if it's the first day of the week and it's dark and there are lamps in the room, then what time would we be thinking this to be? In our way of thinking, it would be what we think of as Saturday night. Okay? They have gathered on Saturday night. So this still isn't a Sunday morning worship service. And what is it that the text just read? That Paul was planning to depart in the morning. So he wasn't planning on hanging out for a worship service. What was he planning on doing? He was going to be traveling. Okay? Now that's not necessarily some desecration of the Sabbath, but we can see that he is not intending on hanging out for a worship service on Sunday. Rather, they have gathered together, and we don't know really what the content of this message is. We can kind of figure through the messages that Paul gives that he is exhorting these people and building them up and encouraging them in the work of the Lord and in the name of the Lord, because he knows he's leaving and he's not going to be back for a really long time. Now, of course, we look at how it is that this is all taking place. We can see really even how it is that this whole event, there's more to this. I mean, he goes down, he raises Eutychus from the dead, and then he goes right back to speaking after that. They go back upstairs, and he finishes the message. So again, in Bible times, when the sun is setting, the next day is beginning. This is why it is that when it's talking about when to observe the Sabbath, it's from even or evening, when the sunset, to sunset, okay? Now, of course, I mentioned that depending on where you are in the world, that becomes a little bit trickier. I remember when I spent some time in Ghana. I was there for just a little less than a month, quite a few years ago. I found it odd. I was used to being in New York at that point in time, and at that time of the year, I don't remember when the sun was setting, but it was April or so. So it was setting at a particular time, and it was rising at particular times. And I remember when we were in Ghana that the time had changed considerably. The sun was setting much earlier. Or I'm sorry, no, it was considerably later than what it was back in New York. And I had to figure out, it's because I'm closer to the equator. So the closer to the equator you are, the more equal your sunsets and sunrises are. The further away from the equator you get, the more that shifts, to the point that there are places in the world where the sun doesn't set for 6 months. Okay? So, of course, in those kind of extreme situations, you can pick a time on your dial and say this will be the hour that we're going to select for the close of the day and the beginning of the new day, okay? In those kinds of extreme situations. But when we don't have those kinds of extreme situations, God made it real easy. The sun sets, new day begins. How hard is that? Not very hard at all. But then what do we have here? As we look at all this issue is so important that God even made this message quite clear. What is it that Revelation, what do we find here in Revelation? Remember that language from the Sabbath commandment that God is the one who made heaven and earth, all that kind of stuff? Look at what we have this message. This is a text we've looked at numerous times. Worship him who did what? Made heaven and earth, the seas, and the fountains of water. So isn't it interesting that this angel who is proclaiming this message here in Revelation chapter 14 is using language from the Sabbath commandment as a way of pointing out who it is that we're being called to worship. So let's take a look then at Jesus' example. So he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up. And as his custom was, he went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day and stood up to read. Now, of course, we've read this one before, and we know what ends up happening in this situation. He reads from the Isaiah scroll, and he basically is announcing his entrance into messianic ministry, and the people don't like it, and they try to put him to death because of it. But what does it tell us? It was his custom to do this, wasn't it? And he continued doing this well beyond this point as well. And then, of course, we even have the words of Jesus referring to something that we know for a fact was going to be happening 4 decades after he says this. Pray that your flight may not be in winter or on Sabbath. He's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem that was going to happen some 40 years later. And what was his intent? His intent was that his people would be still observing the Sabbath 40 years later. So if there were to be this change in an aspect of God's moral law, don't you think Jesus would have had time to say something about it? Don't you think he would have made it a big deal? How many times when we read the book of Moses and we look at how there's a description of somebody who desecrates the 10 Commandments, and there is a specific kind of punishment that is decreed upon them. What are those punishments usually? Sometimes there's, exile. But there are certain commandments that when you break those, it's a death sentence. Okay? And incidentally, the Sabbath is one of them. Okay? Did God care? Did it matter to him? If he was going to change that, don't you think he would have made it big bold, blinking, flashing lights, unequivocal, that we don't have to play kind of mental gymnastics in order to reach these kinds of conclusions? But there's nothing. There is no decree anywhere where God says, okay, that doesn't matter anymore. But there is a statement where somebody else would try to change times and laws. We'll get into that a little bit later on, but think about it. If this is an entity that's being spoken of in the book of Daniel that's thinking to change times and laws, is this man's law that it's being concerned about? What would be so important about man's law that God would mention it? Whose law would be the issue here? Man's or God's? There's another entity who thinks to change times and laws, God's time and laws. Now, there's only one commandment that has anything to do with time, and it's the Sabbath. We're going to get into that deeper. Like I said, there's a lot more to this than what we've looked at so far. The Sabbath is infinitely more than just a day. There is something powerfully significant to it. So how then did all of this changing stuff happen? Where did it all come from? How did this go about? Why is it that we have this idea that we can take and knock out some portion of God's law that just doesn't fit our thought process? Well, it actually is something that took place gradually. It happened over time. So it actually began, believe it or not, way, way, way back. There's a lot of people who are going to point to Constantine, and yes, I'm about to mention Constantine in a minute, but Constantine isn't the guy who changed the Sabbath. Let me just say that point blank. He is not the one who changed the Sabbath. He was somebody who enacted a law that lent in that direction, but he didn't just make it up off the top of his head. Say, okay, we're going to do this instead. Okay, there was this whole big, long, drawn-out process that actually begins back with the Jewish people and the Christians and the Romans. How did this start? Well, you have the Jewish people who were constantly revolting against the Romans. The Romans were getting tired of this, these little uprisings that would take place. And so what they would do, they actually kind of copied the Greeks. Back in the time before the Maccabean revolt, when the Greeks were kind of in charge over the region of Jerusalem, they would, for whatever reason, didn't like the Jews, and so they were like, hey, we know, why get into all these sword fights with these guys and risk injuring ourselves? We know where they're going to be on a particular day of the week, and we know they're not going to have weapons with them, okay? So let's just go to their synagogues on this Sabbath of theirs. There won't be any fighting, and we can just take them captive. That's what the Greeks did, which is why the Maccabean revolt became such a big deal, because this guy, Maccabee, said, okay, it's okay for you to arm yourselves and to fight back on the Sabbath because you're preserving life. That's why people gravitated towards his revolt, and it became such a big deal. The Romans ended up doing the same thing. We know where they're going to be on this certain day of the week. We know they're not going to fight back. So let's just go to their synagogues on this Sabbath of theirs. We'll take them captive. The problem was that the Christians were also being caught up in all of this. So the Christians, at least some, said, we're going to distance ourselves a little bit from this because we don't want to be caught up in this. We're not responsible for this Jewish uprising. We don't want to get taken off captive as well. So let's create a little separation between us and them. So some started meeting on the first day of the week instead of on Sabbath with the Jewish congregations. They end up doing this over a course of time. The practice eventually gets to Rome, where there were people who started practicing this. The church had been kind of formalized there in Rome. In fact, there was this big discussion at one point in time of where should the seat of the church be? Should it be in Jerusalem, where it started from, or should it be here in the city of Rome, where their what's the word I'm looking for? Apostasies have not reached us. So we have a more pure faith here in Rome. Well, the decision was made by the people in Rome that it should be in Rome. Sounds like kind of a group decision, right? Everybody unanimously voted. Except for everybody else. So they made this decision to make the seat of the church there in Rome. And so then they started taking these practices that were kind of in place and enforcing them. And at first there was only 2 places in the Christian world that actually started observing this on mass scale. It was the city of Rome and Alexandria, Egypt. That's it. All the rest of the Christian world continued keeping Sabbath. Okay? Until you have this guy come along whose name was Constantine. He receives this vision as he's off on a military conquest that he was to fight under the sign of the cross. And incidentally, the sign of the cross that he actually had a vision of was more like an X. It wasn't the cross that you and I think of, it was an X. But the X at the time was a symbol of the Christian faith because it was the first Greek letter for the name of Christ. The chi is what that's called. Or some people might pronounce it Chi. It doesn't matter. But that's really where it got its start from. This guy Constantine then professes to be a Christian, and he enacts a law in the year 321 AD. And take a look at what this says. On the venerable day of the sun, let the magistrates and people residing in cities rest, and let shops be closed. So this is a portion of what it is that Constantine's decree has to say. It's kind of an enforcing of now we're going to take and make this whole first day of the week a substantiated issue. But is there a text from the scriptures to support this? Is there anything from the scriptures to support this? There is nothing. Now, so let's take a look here at something else. This is something that was written much, much later than this. It's from a particular little book that I'm going to show you, so get your pencils ready if you want to take down notes. There's a question here. It says, which day is the Sabbath? The answer is Saturday is the Sabbath. So then there's this next question. Why do we observe Sunday instead of Saturday? Answer, because the Catholic Church transferred the solemnity or the holiness from Saturday to Sunday, and that's from a Convert's Catechism, page 50. But there's even more to this than just this little statement here. Take a look at what somebody else had to say. Fundamentalists meet for worship on Sunday, yet there is no evidence in the Bible that corporate worship was to be made on Sundays. The Jewish Sabbath, or day of rest, was, of course, Saturday. It was the Catholic Church that decided Sunday should be the day of worship for Christians in honor of the resurrection. And there was Carl Keating, Catholicism and Fundamentalism, page 38. Now, these are books that are written a long time ago. None of this is new. This is really, really old stuff, okay? And these are all people who were a part of the Catholic Church. In fact, they go on to say that everybody who is claiming to be separated from the Catholic Church are really following our doctrines. Okay, so are they really that separated? If they're continuing to follow the teachings that we established, how separated can they be? How many of you know what the word Protestant means? A protester. A protester against what? Against the Catholic Church. That's where the term Protestant comes from. It's a term that was deemed over 500 years ago. And it was started by a guy named Martin Luther. No, not Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther, who was a religious figure many years ago, 500 years ago. And he was the person who, the 95 Theses that was nailed to the church door in Württemberg, which was what's called the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. Even though he wasn't the first person to question these things, there were people before him who questioned them, but he made bold moves. Because there's also something else that happened right about that same time. It's called the printing press was being made, where they then took Luther's 95 things that he had against the church, and they could mass publish it. They could print them and distribute them widely. Now people actually had access to this information, whereas before, the access to the information was only as fast as you could handwrite the documents. So these words got out, these messages got out. And then, of course, you have other people like John Calvin, John Huss, William Tyndale, Zwingli, all these different names that we can think of, all of which are responsible for popping up little ideas that were buried under traditionalism of Catholicism. Okay? Where Catholicism says, no. You don't need to pray to God. You come pray to us. Yeah, I know that the Bible says that only God can forgive sins, but, so can we. Okay? And you go ahead and call me Father, and I will give you absolution from your sins as well. None of that is in the scriptures anywhere. But this is one more statement here as well. You may read the Bible from Genesis to Revelation. You will not find a single line authorizing the sanctification of Sunday. The scriptures enforce the religious observance of Saturday. These are statements that they themselves are making boldly and point blank. They are admitting there's no authority on the scripture for this. So again, where is it that all of this comes from? It comes from man taking attempts to twist God's law into something else. Here's the funny thing. God has one genuine way of being worshiped, and he has even said, this is the way to worship me, nothing else will do. But Satan, for every truth that God has, Satan has 1,000 counterfeits. Now, if you were a teller at a store, okay, a cashier, and somebody comes, they give you a $20 bill, they're buying something, okay, you look at it, and of course, what do you see half the time now when it's like a $20 or a $50 bill? They pick the thing up and they want to look at it, and they make you think, are you calling me a crook or something? Checking for that watermark or whatever? They're making sure that's genuine. What if somebody showed up with a $20 bill from Monopoly money? Okay. Would you be at all even tempted to take that at all? No. Why? Because it's obvious that it's not genuine. It's obvious that it's fake. But what if somebody gave you a $50 bill that looked like the real thing, felt like the real thing, had everything that it needed? You've checked all these $50 bills for watermarks. You've seen them all, but you just grab this one and you figure, well, it looks and it feels as much the same as all the rest of these, so I'm not going to bother to check this one. So I'll just put it in the cash register, only to find out that that was fake. How much easier would it be to be duped then? Pretty easy. Why? Because it looks really close to the genuine, doesn't it? So which one is more deceptive? The one that is the obvious fake, or the one that's so close that you can barely tell the difference? The one that's extremely close. But the one that's extremely close is still robbing you of what is valuable. God's Sabbath, friends, is valuable. His law is valuable. He is the one who has placed value in it. It has nothing to do with what value we place upon it. It's about the value that God himself has placed upon it. And because he has placed value on it, and because he has given it to us, we should place that same kind of value on it. It isn't about our decisions. It isn't about what it is that we want to do. Aside from the fact that God places value on his law, he placed the value of his life on this law. If the law could just be so flippantly changed, then why would Christ have to die on the cross? He could just change it. Let's just change the rules of the game midstream. That's what we see a lot of people doing. Oh, we don't like how this is going, so we're just going to change the rules as they go. What do we call a government that does that? We call it a banana republic. It's not going the way I want, so I'm going to change the rules of the game midstream. Okay? If God's government were like that, that's what he would have done, and Jesus never would have had to die on the cross. But because that can't happen, he said, I have a different solution for the problem, and it's going to be my life for yours. That was his solution. It wasn't changing the Sabbath. It wasn't changing the Ten Commandments at any level. It was my life for yours. That was his solution. And what is it that his solution has created? But it has created something where we can then commune with God in a more open and special way. We can come together. We can recognize the fact that we are saved by grace through faith. There's no check marks that we can check off and we're getting our points with God. We're punching our spiritual clock to make sure that we're earning our way into heaven. The fact of the matter is we are saved by grace through faith. There is no law that we can observe that will gain us access to heaven. The only thing we can do is accept Christ as our atonement for sin and to recognize that he has paid the price for us. And because we love him for that, what do we do? What was it that Jesus said? If you love me, keep my commandments. There was a psychologist who had made a statement here. The best proof of love is trust. So are we going to trust God? Are we going to trust what he has put before us? Are we going to say, no, God, it's not good enough. We need to change what you have given us and do it our way instead. Point one story in the Bible to me where that has ever worked. There just isn't anything. And then how is it that the people just before Christ returns are categorized? Here is the patience of the saints. Here are those who do what? They keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus. There was a story, this is back in the early 1800s, 1816 as a matter of fact. The U.S. Army built a fort to protect against Canadian invasion. But what they found was this fort that they had built was actually 30 miles inside Canadian territory. There are a lot of people who are making very genuine decisions, but unfortunately they are outside the borders of what God has deemed to be done. The action may be right, but we have to be doing it back inside the borders of what God has said. This is where and how and when you do it.